Tell me honestly, did $5 change the way you saw me?
No, sir. Your tip reflects your decision. My service reflects my character.
Tell me, if a stranger handed you $5 after treating you like you were invisible, would you walk away with the money or with your dignity? The question would echo through one of the finest restaurants in Manhattan before the night was over, but at exactly 7:18 p.m., no one except one elderly man in a tailored navy suit knew the test had already begun. William Harrington sat alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, where streams of yellow cabs glided beneath the glow of spring rain. Every detail around him reflected quiet luxury. Crystal glasses caught the warm amber light. White linen rested perfectly across polished walnut tables. A pianist filled the room with slow jazz that seemed to disappear into the conversations of hedge fund managers, attorneys, and tourists celebrating milestones they would remember for years. William barely noticed any of it. At 72, he had spent 4 decades building one of the largest logistics companies in America. Financial magazines called him a visionary. Television hosts praised his discipline. Investors admired the fortune he had accumulated, estimated at nearly $6 billion. Yet none of those headlines interested him anymore. His doctors had recently given him news that money could not negotiate away. And for the first time in his life, William found himself asking a question no board meeting had ever answered. Who truly deserves trust? Across the dining room, Naomi Brooks balanced a heavy-serving tray with practiced confidence. 29 years old, she moved with calm precision that years in the service industry had quietly perfected. She greeted every table with the same gentle smile, remembered every allergy without writing it down, and somehow noticed empty water glasses before anyone asked. Most guests never remembered her face after leaving, but nearly all remembered how comfortable they felt while she served them. She worked double shifts 6 days a week, then drove 23 miles to the small brick house outside Yonkers where her grandmother waited, often forgetting what day it was, but never forgetting Naomi's voice. Bills came faster than paychecks. Sleep came in short pieces. Complaints, however, rarely escaped her lips. She believed that kindness lost its value the moment it depended on being rewarded. William watched quietly as Naomi stopped to help an elderly couple read the dessert menu without making them feel embarrassed. Moments later, she crouched beside a little boy who had accidentally dropped his fork, replacing it with a clean one before his parents could apologize. She treated every person exactly the same, whether they wore designer watches or faded denim jackets. William folded his hands together. For months, he had visited restaurants, hotels, airports, and cafes across the country searching for something he could not define. His attorneys believed he was reviewing hospitality investments. His board assumed he was relaxing before retirement. Only William knew the truth. He had been observing ordinary people placed in ordinary moments, convinced that character revealed itself when expectations quietly disappeared. Tonight, his attention remained fixed on Naomi. When dinner ended, the check arrived inside a black leather folder totaling just over $400. William signed the receipt without hesitation, slipped a single $5 bill beneath the folder, and stood slowly, deliberately leaving behind an expensive fountain pen resting beside his coffee cup. He adjusted his jacket, thanked Naomi with a polite nod, and walked toward the revolving glass doors without looking back. Outside, cool rain drifted across the sidewalk as pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. William stopped just beyond the entrance where reflections shimmered across the wet pavement. He wasn't waiting for a taxi. He wasn't waiting for the rain to stop. He was waiting to discover whether $5 could measure a person's heart or expose his own. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Table. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. Naomi watched the revolving door close behind the distinguished guest before gathering the leather check presenter from the table with the same quiet rhythm she had repeated thousands of times over the years. She never looked at the receipt immediately. Her routine never changed. First came the folded linen napkin, then the water glasses, then the polished silverware placed carefully onto the serving tray. Only after the table looked exactly as it had before the guest arrived did she open the folder. The crisp $5 bill rested neatly inside. For the briefest moment, the restaurant around her seemed quieter. A nearby server glanced over her shoulder and raised an eyebrow. "That is all," he whispered under his breath. Naomi simply folded the receipt, closed again. "It is what he chose to leave," she answered softly. There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. The young server frowned. "After a dinner like that, I would be upset." Naomi offered a gentle smile while lifting another stack of plates. "If I let every tip decide my mood, I would give strangers too much control over my life." She carried the dishes toward the service station where steam drifted from the kitchen doors and the familiar scent of garlic, rosemary, and fresh bread filled the warm air. Around her, cooks called out orders while glasses clinked and espresso machines hissed in steady rhythm. It was organized chaos, yet Naomi moved through it with remarkable calm. Her manager, Rebecca Collins, noticed the receipt while reviewing the evening reports. "Everything all right?" she asked. Naomi nodded. "Everything is fine." Rebecca looked down at the signed bill and sighed quietly. "Sometimes wealthy people surprise me." Naomi shook her head. "Maybe he has reasons I do not know." Rebecca studied her for a second before returning the folder. "You always find the kindest explanation." Naomi laughed gently. "It makes long shifts easier." She returned to the dining room, preparing another table for arriving guests when something near the window caught her eye. Resting beside the coffee cup was a black fountain pen trimmed with brushed platinum. Even before picking it up, she recognized that it was valuable. The weight felt substantial in her hand, balanced with the craftsmanship of something built to last generations instead of years. She twisted the cap slightly and noticed two small engraved initials near the clip. WH. She looked toward the entrance just as the doorman held the revolving door for another couple entering from the rain. The gentleman with the navy suit was already halfway down the sidewalk. Naomi did not hesitate. "Rebecca, I will be right back." Wrapping the pen carefully inside a clean linen napkin, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. Tiny raindrops rested on her sleeves as she scanned the crowded sidewalk. Yellow taxis splashed through shallow puddles while office workers hurried beneath umbrellas, their footsteps echoing across the wet pavement. Nearly 50 yards away, she spotted William standing near the curb, watching traffic without appearing to wait for anyone. "Sir," she called, careful not to shout across the street. He turned slowly as she approached, slightly out of breath, but still smiling. "You left this behind." She unfolded the napkin and revealed the fountain pen. William looked at it for several silent seconds before lifting his eyes to meet hers. "That pen belonged to my father," he said quietly. "I have carried it for almost 40 years. Naomi extended it toward him without hesitation. "Then I am glad it found its way back." William accepted the pen, studying her expression with unusual intensity. There was no expectation in her eyes, no disappointment, no hidden request, only quiet sincerity. The rain continued falling softly between them, while Manhattan rushed forward without noticing that something far more valuable than money had just changed hands. William closed his fingers around the fountain pen, but made no effort to slip it back into his pocket. Instead, he studied Naomi with the quiet concentration of a man who had spent a lifetime reading balance sheets, negotiations, and boardrooms, yet suddenly found himself unable to explain the simplest human choice. Most people would have assumed the pen was expensive enough to sell. Others might have expected a generous reward after returning something so valuable. Naomi had done neither. She simply stood beneath the soft drizzle, her restaurant apron catching tiny beads of rain, while the lights of Midtown reflected across the wet sidewalk like ribbons of gold. "Thank you," William said at last. "You are very welcome, sir," Naomi replied with the same calm warmth she had offered inside the restaurant. She gave a polite nod and turned toward the entrance, believing the evening had already reached its ordinary ending. "Miss," William called before she reached the revolving door. She stopped and looked back. "May I ask you something?" Naomi smiled politely. "Of course." William took a slow step closer. "Did the $5 tip disappoint you?" The question lingered between them while passing taxis splashed through shallow puddles and distant sirens blended into the rhythm of the city. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment before answering. "It surprised me a little," she admitted honestly. "But disappointment is different from surprise." William waited. She continued. Every guest has a story that I cannot see. Some people give generously because they have abundance. Others give very little because they carry burdens I will never know. I try not to judge either one. William narrowed his eyes slightly. Even when it feels unfair? Naomi nodded. Fairness is not always mine to measure. My responsibility is simply to do my work with integrity. Those words settled into William's thoughts with unexpected weight. For months, he had heard polished speeches from executives, consultants, and nonprofit leaders competing for his attention. They spoke about leadership, vision, and legacy using carefully prepared language. Yet standing on a rainy Manhattan sidewalk, a waitress wearing comfortable black shoes and an apron lightly dusted with flour had expressed more wisdom in 2 quiet sentences than most of those meetings combined. William glanced down at the fountain pen again. My father used to tell me that the smallest decisions reveal the largest truths. Naomi smiled gently. He sounds like a wise man. William looked toward the glowing windows of the restaurant. He built a small hardware store in Ohio. He never became wealthy, but everyone trusted him. When he passed away, people stood outside in the snow for 3 blocks just to say goodbye. His voice softened. I spent my life becoming successful. Sometimes I wonder if I became as trustworthy as he was. Naomi listened without interrupting. She did not rush to comfort him or pretend to know the answer. The silence between them felt respectful instead of awkward. Finally, she said, "Success gives people reasons to admire you. Character gives them reasons to remember you." William looked directly into her eyes. There was no performance in her expression, no attempt to impress someone whose name she still did not know. She had simply spoken from the values she carried long before either of them arrived at this restaurant. Across the street, a black sedan eased quietly toward the curb. The driver remained inside, waiting patiently. William noticed the familiar vehicle, but made no move to enter it. For the first time that evening, the test he believed he had designed no longer felt like it belonged to the waitress. As the rain continued falling in gentle silver lines beneath the city lights, an uncomfortable realization settled into his heart. Perhaps the person being measured had never been Naomi Brooks at all. The black sedan remained waiting at the curb, its headlights reflecting across the rain-soaked pavement. But William still did not move toward it. Instead, he slipped the fountain pen into his inside pocket with unusual care, almost as though it had become heavier during the last few minutes. He looked back at Naomi, who had already placed one hand on the polished brass handle of the restaurant door, ready to return to the evening rush. "One last question," he said. She turned again, patient despite knowing other tables would soon need her attention. "Yes, sir." William took a slow breath. "If you knew before serving me that I would only leave $5, would you have treated me differently?" Naomi considered the question carefully instead of answering immediately. The city hummed around them while soft rain settled onto the shoulders of their coats. Finally, she smiled, not because the question amused her, but because it reminded her of something her grandmother often repeated. "No, sir," she said quietly. "People deserve respect before they earn generosity. If I only offered my best service to generous people, then my kindness would simply become another product for sale." William felt those words settle somewhere far deeper than he expected. He had spent years believing every decision could be measured by return on investment. Every partnership, every acquisition, every negotiation eventually came down to numbers. Yet this young woman had just described integrity as something that could not be purchased, negotiated, or rented by the hour. Before William could respond, the restaurant door opened behind Naomi. Rebecca Collins stepped outside carrying an umbrella, clearly searching for her employee. "Naomi," she called with concern. "Table 12 just arrived." Naomi nodded immediately. "I will be right there." Rebecca glanced politely toward William before returning inside. Naomi looked back at him once more. "I hope you have a safe evening, sir." William hesitated. "May I ask your name?" "Naomi Brooks." He repeated it slowly, making certain he would remember every syllable. "Thank you, Miss Brooks." She offered a small smile before disappearing through the revolving door, leaving only the soft movement of warm light spilling onto the sidewalk before the glass settled back into place. William remained standing for another long moment. His driver finally stepped from the sedan, holding a large umbrella overhead. "Everything all right, Mr. Harrington?" William answered without taking his eyes off the restaurant entrance. "No, Charles." The driver looked surprised. William continued in a thoughtful voice. Everything is becoming clear. They climbed into the sedan, where the quiet leather interior muffled the sounds of the city outside. As the vehicle merged into evening traffic, Charles glanced into the rearview mirror. "Straight home, sir." William shook his head. "Take me to Harrington Foundation headquarters." Charles blinked. "At this hour?" "Yes." The windshield wipers moved steadily as skyscrapers drifted past the windows like silent monuments. William reached into his briefcase and removed a thick folder. Labeled estate planning. Colored tabs marked revisions his legal team had suggested over the previous 6 months. He flipped through page after page without truly reading them. Every carefully drafted paragraph suddenly felt incomplete. Every distribution plan seemed focused on wealth rather than worth. He closed the folder and rested one hand over the pocket holding his father's fountain pen. For years he had searched for someone capable of proving that genuine character still existed without realizing the answer would not arrive through an executive presentation, a charity gala, or an exclusive board meeting. It would appear carrying a serving tray, wearing a simple apron, and walking back into a restaurant without the slightest idea that one ordinary conversation had already begun changing the legacy of one of the wealthiest men in America. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Table. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. The Harrington Foundation headquarters occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson River. But despite the sweeping skyline and the priceless artwork lining its halls, the atmosphere inside felt unusually heavy that evening. Most offices were already dark. Cleaning crews moved quietly through empty corridors while the soft hum of air conditioning echoed against marble floors. William walked directly into the executive conference room, where 3 members of his legal team looked up in surprise. They had not expected another meeting after 8 o'clock. Margaret Ellis, his longtime estate attorney, closed the file she had been reviewing. "William, we thought you had gone home." He removed his raincoat slowly and placed his father's fountain pen on the polished conference table. "I need to review every page of my estate plan again." Margaret exchanged a brief glance with the others. Did something happen at dinner? William remained standing instead of taking his usual seat at the head of the table. "Yes, I realized I have been asking the wrong question." The attorneys waited in silence. William looked toward the city lights beyond the windows. "For months I have been trying to identify who deserves my money." He paused before quietly adding, "Tonight I met someone who reminded me I should have been looking for who deserves my trust." Margaret folded her hands together. She had worked with William for nearly 20 years and recognized the thoughtful tone that usually preceded one of his biggest decisions. "Who was this person?" William smiled faintly. "A waitress." One of the younger attorneys blinked with visible surprise, but wisely remained silent. William continued, "She had every reason to resent me. Instead, she returned something precious without expecting anything in return. Then she explained dignity in fewer words than I have heard from any leadership consultant I have ever hired." He rested one hand lightly on the fountain pen. That conversation exposed a flaw in this entire document. Margaret opened the estate binder again. "Which section concerns you?" William walked slowly around the room. "Every section that assumes money alone creates a legacy." Across town, Naomi had no idea her ordinary shift had become the subject of discussion inside one of the city's most influential boardrooms. She refilled coffee cups, carried dessert plates, and congratulated an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. Near closing time, a teenage busser accidentally dropped a stack of clean glasses. The sharp sound echoed through the dining room before complete silence followed. The young employee stood frozen, his face turning pale with embarrassment. Before the manager could even reach him, Naomi knelt beside the scattered pieces, gently placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked first. The teenager shook his head. "I am just embarrassed." Naomi smiled warmly. "Then today is a good day. Glass can be replaced. People cannot." The tension immediately eased. Even Rebecca, who had started walking over with concern, stopped and smiled quietly before helping clean the area. None of the guests complained. A few even thanked the staff for handling the situation with such calm professionalism. Nearly an hour later, Naomi finally clocked out, changed into a simple gray sweater, and stepped into the cool night, carrying a reusable grocery bag instead of a designer purse. She boarded the northbound commuter train, found a window seat, and watched Manhattan slowly fade behind her. Exhaustion settled into her shoulders, but her expression remained peaceful. She still believed the evening had been completely ordinary. Meanwhile, William remained in the conference room staring at the untouched estate plan spread before him. He slowly uncapped his father's fountain pen and wrote a single sentence across the first page in steady blue ink. A legacy should reward character before it rewards success. As the ink dried beneath the quiet lights of the empty boardroom, every attorney around the table sensed that the document governing billions of dollars was no longer merely being revised. It was beginning to tell an entirely different story. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that spilled across the Hudson River, turning the water into rippling bands of silver. Inside Harrington Foundation headquarters, the city was only beginning to wake, yet William had already been sitting alone in his office for nearly 2 hours. The untouched cup of black coffee beside him had long since grown cold. Before him rested 3 objects that seemed strangely connected now: his father's fountain pen, the estate binder filled with carefully prepared legal language, and a simple restaurant receipt with a $5 tip printed beneath his signature. For years he had believed wealth gave him the privilege to evaluate people. Now he wondered whether wealth had quietly prevented him from truly seeing them. He lifted the receipt once more, tracing the faded ink with his fingertips before folding it carefully and placing it inside the estate binder. Across town, Naomi stepped onto the front porch of the modest brick house she shared with her grandmother. The morning air carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming dogwood trees while birds filled the quiet neighborhood with cheerful songs. Before leaving for another shift, she paused beside the flower bed that her grandmother had planted decades earlier. Several blossoms had begun to droop after the previous night's rain. Without thinking, Naomi knelt, gently straightened the small wooden supports, and brushed damp soil away from the stems. The task took only a minute, but she finished it with the same patience she brought to every table she served. Behind the screen door, her grandmother's familiar voice drifted outside. "Talking to the flowers again?" Naomi smiled. "Only listening today." Her grandmother laughed softly. "Flowers and people have something in common. They grow best when somebody notices them." Naomi carried those words with her all the way to the commuter train. She never realized how perfectly they echoed the conversation that continued unfolding inside William's thoughts miles away. Mid-morning sunlight streamed through the conference room windows as Margaret Ellis returned with revised estate documents. She found William standing beside the glass wall overlooking Manhattan instead of reviewing paperwork. "I have prepared several options," she said carefully. "Scholarships, charitable trusts, expanded hospital funding, or adjustments to family distributions." William nodded without turning around. "Those are all worthwhile." He remained silent for another moment before quietly adding, "But I think I have been trying to solve the wrong problem." Margaret waited. "Money repairs many things," William continued, "but it cannot teach character. It can only support people who already possess it." The room fell still except for the distant sound of traffic floating upward from the streets below. Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "You keep returning to the Waitress." William smiled faintly. "Not because she impressed me." He looked out toward the skyline, where sunlight reflected from hundreds of windows. "Because she reminded me of the man I wanted to become before success made every conversation sound like a transaction." Margaret lowered her eyes to the fountain pen resting beside the binder. "Your father would probably be proud of that realization." William's expression softened. "I hope so." Neither spoke. Again for several seconds. The silence felt unusually peaceful, like the pause after rain when the world seemed cleaner without anyone noticing exactly when the sky had changed. William finally opened the binder, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. Every page waiting before him represented years of planning. Yet for the first time, the numbers mattered less than the values guiding them. Somewhere across the city, Naomi was tying on her apron, greeting another guest with the same sincere smile she offered everyone else, completely unaware that her ordinary kindness had become the calm center of a decision far greater than either of them could yet imagine. 3 days later, A handwritten invitation arrived at the restaurant in a plain ivory envelope addressed simply to Naomi Brooks. Rebecca Collins handed it to her during the afternoon lull between lunch and dinner service. "Looks important," she said with a curious smile. Naomi carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a thick cream-colored card embossed with the Harrington Foundation seal. It invited her to attend a private luncheon the following afternoon at Foundation headquarters, requesting only one thing. "Please come exactly as you are." Naomi read the final sentence twice before looking up in quiet confusion. She did not recognize the Foundation's name, and nothing in the letter explained why she had been invited. Rebecca glanced at the elegant stationery. "Do you know these people?" Naomi slowly shook her head. "I do not think so." That evening, after helping her grandmother prepare a simple dinner, Naomi mentioned the invitation. Her grandmother adjusted her reading glasses, studied the card for a long moment, then smiled knowingly. "Sometimes life sends an answer before it explains the question." Naomi laughed softly. "That sounds like something only you would say." The older woman reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, do not try to become someone different. The person who received this invitation is already enough." The following afternoon, sunlight poured through the towering windows of the Harrington Foundation lobby, reflecting across polished stone floors that seemed almost too perfect to step on. Naomi arrived wearing the same navy blue dress she reserved for church and family celebrations. She carried no designer handbag, wore no expensive jewelry, and quietly thanked the receptionist when she was escorted upstairs. Every hallway displayed photographs of hospitals, schools, and community centers supported by the Foundation, yet the building itself felt surprisingly peaceful rather than intimidating. When the conference room doors opened, Naomi stopped for a brief moment. William Harrington stood waiting near the long walnut table. Margaret Ellis sat beside several Foundation trustees, while Charles, the driver, quietly poured glasses of water near the windows. William walked forward with a warm smile very different from the reserved expression she remembered from the restaurant. "Miss Brooks," he said, "thank you for accepting my invitation." Naomi nodded politely. "Thank you for inviting me, sir. Although I must admit, I am still wondering why I am here." William gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. There is something I owe you." After everyone settled, the room became remarkably still. William rested both hands on the conference table before speaking. "3 nights ago, I visited your restaurant with a purpose I did not reveal." Naomi listened quietly. "The $5 tip was intentional," William continued. "I wanted to see whether generosity from a customer determined the kindness of the person serving them." Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment, but said nothing. William's voice softened with unmistakable regret. "I believed I was testing your character." He paused before adding the words that had echoed through his thoughts ever since. "Instead, you revealed mine." No one around the table moved. Even the faint sound of traffic beyond the windows seemed to disappear. William continued, "I have spent years evaluating people through carefully designed situations, believing wisdom gave me the right to judge them. You answered every question I never asked with honesty, humility, and grace. Then you returned something precious without expecting recognition or reward. That night I realized the flaw was never in the people I tested. It was in the man creating the test." Naomi looked at him with quiet compassion rather than triumph. Her gentle smile carried no trace of satisfaction, only understanding. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the greatest answers are the ones that change the person asking the question." Those simple words settled across the room like morning light, and for the first time in many years, William Harrington felt that no amount of wealth could equal the freedom of finally seeing the truth clearly. The conference room remained silent long after Naomi finished speaking. No one reached for a notebook. No one interrupted. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished walnut table, casting warm reflections over stacks of legal documents that only hours earlier had seemed far more important than they did now. William slowly opened the estate binder and turned several pages before stopping near the middle. He lifted his father's fountain pen, uncapped it with practiced care, and signed the final amendment that Margaret Ellis had prepared only moments before. The gentle sound of ink gliding across paper echoed softly through the room. When he finished, he looked toward the trustees. "Effective immediately," he said calmly. The Harrington Legacy Initiative will replace the private inheritance project we discussed last year. Margaret slid another folder toward Naomi. She accepted it with visible uncertainty. What is this? She asked. William smiled. Not a gift. Naomi looked at him curiously. He continued, It is a promise. Margaret opened the folder so Naomi could read the first page. The title simply read, The Service and Dignity Initiative. Beneath it appeared a mission statement dedicated to supporting students entering hospitality careers, single-family caregivers returning to school, and frontline service professionals seeking leadership education. Scholarships, emergency assistance grants, mentorship programs, and community partnerships filled the following pages. Naomi quietly turned each sheet without speaking. This is remarkable, she whispered. William nodded. It will be funded through my revised estate plan. Naomi looked up with surprise. Because of one conversation? William gently shook his head. No, because of what that conversation revealed. He folded his hands together. I spent decades believing success should be rewarded. You reminded me that character deserves to be multiplied. Naomi carefully closed the folder before sliding it back across the table. Sir, I hope you understand something. William tilted his head slightly. Please tell me. She smiled with the same quiet sincerity that had first caught his attention. You do not owe me anything. Several trustees exchanged thoughtful glances. William's expression softened. Perhaps not, he answered. But I owe the future an example that wealth should follow wisdom, not pride. Naomi remained silent, allowing his words to settle naturally. After a few moments, she spoke again. If this program helps people who feel invisible discover that their work has value, then it will already be more meaningful than anything with my name attached. William looked toward Margaret. Then remove her name from the title. Naomi blinked in surprise. William continued. Call it the Dignity Initiative instead. This was never about honoring one person. It is about protecting the principle she reminded us to see. Margaret smiled as she wrote the change into her notes. The trustees nodded in quiet agreement. The atmosphere inside the room had shifted completely. Hours earlier, they had expected another routine estate meeting centered on numbers and percentages. Instead, they had witnessed a conversation about values that no financial model could calculate. As the meeting concluded, William walked Naomi toward the elevator himself. Before the doors opened, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed the familiar $5 bill, now pressed flat inside a small protective sleeve. I kept this, he said. Naomi looked at it with gentle amusement. Most people would have forgotten it by now. William smiled. I never will. It reminds me that the smallest amount of money can reveal the greatest amount of truth. Naomi looked at the bill one final time before the elevator doors quietly opened. Then I hope, she said softly, it reminds you that people are always worth more than the tests we give them. William nodded without hesitation. It already does. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, William remained standing exactly where she had left him, holding a simple $5 bill that had somehow become the most valuable lesson of his entire life. 6 months later, autumn sunlight filtered through rows of golden maple trees outside a renovated community learning center on the west side of Manhattan. A modest bronze plaque near the entrance reflected the morning light without drawing attention to itself. It did not carry the name of a billionaire, a corporation, or a family fortune. Instead, it displayed a single sentence engraved beneath the words The Dignity Initiative. Character grows strongest where kindness expects nothing in return. Inside, dozens of hospitality workers, caregivers, restaurant employees, hotel staff, and adult students gathered for the first leadership scholarship orientation. Some hoped to finish college after years away from classrooms. Others dreamed of opening small businesses or earning management positions they once believed were out of reach. None of them knew the entire story behind the program that had brought them together. They only knew that someone had believed their work deserved respect. Across the city, Naomi tied on her familiar apron before the lunch rush began. The restaurant looked exactly as it always had. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath warm lights. Fresh flowers rested on each table. The scent of baked bread drifted gently from the kitchen. New guests filled the dining room without recognizing the woman who greeted them with the same calm smile she had offered every customer long before anyone spoke her name inside Foundation boardrooms. Rebecca Collins approached while organizing reservations. You know, she said with a grin, Someone from that foundation called again this morning. They still want you to speak at next month's event. Naomi laughed softly while arranging silverware. There are people with much more important stories than mine. Rebecca shook her head. Maybe, but not many people remind others how to see each other. Naomi simply smiled and welcomed another family through the front doors. Nothing about her routine had changed because she never believed kindness should become a performance after receiving recognition. On the opposite side of Manhattan, William Harrington stood quietly near the back of the Learning Center as students filled the auditorium. He had declined every request to place his portrait in the building or attach his family name to the initiative. The only object he carried was the same fountain pen his father had once owned. Margaret Ellis stepped beside him and handed over the final copy of his revised estate plan. "Everything has been completed," she said. William nodded, looking instead toward the young students laughing together before the program began. "Good," he answered quietly. "Now it belongs to them." Margaret smiled. "You changed far more than a will." William glanced toward the windows where afternoon light washed across the room with gentle warmth. "No," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "A waitress changed a man. The man simply changed the paperwork." At that very moment, miles away, Naomi poured fresh coffee for an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. She listened patiently as they shared stories from 50 years of marriage, congratulated them with genuine joy, and wished them many more happy years together. They thanked her before leaving a generous tip beneath the check. Naomi smiled with the same gratitude she had shown for $5 months earlier, because neither amount had ever determined the way she saw the people sitting across from her. Outside, leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalk as the afternoon breeze carried them toward the busy streets beyond. Life continued moving forward with its familiar rhythm. Somewhere, students stepped confidently toward futures they once thought impossible. Somewhere else, a billionaire finally understood that the greatest inheritance was never measured in dollars. And inside a quiet restaurant filled with ordinary conversations, an ordinary waitress continued serving strangers with extraordinary grace, never realizing that the most powerful legacy she helped create was not written in legal documents or engraved on bronze plaques, but carried silently in every life that would forever be changed by the simple decision to choose dignity over judgment and kindness over pride. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching. And until next time, we'll save you a seat at the Hidden Table.